Hi friends, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be wrapping up October and November. So October I read 5 books. One was a reread. I reread Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood, which was something that I read earlier this year as an ARC, and then once it was published, I wanted to reread it. I do notice here that I have reduced my rating on it to like a just fine 2.5 stars. This is about B, and she is working as a scientist with NASA to develop like these space helmets. So what I have written here is that I was not that charmed with the story on the reread. Something that I really liked about Love on the Brain the first time was how I pictured the main character and like her narrative voice. I listened to the audio when I reread it, and having the audiobook narrate her differently than how I pictured her, I realized that like I wasn't quite as charmed with like the quirks of the character as when I gave her my narrative voice, like a narrative voice from my imagination. And once that was gone, I started just seeing all of the repetitions that Ali Hazelwood produces in her writing, which is fine, but maybe not something that you want to experience all like in the same year. Maybe 5 years from now, I will pick up an Ali Hazelwood and it will be fun again, you know? Finished that on October 14th. That was a reread, and I gave it 2.5 stars. Hold please. So then the library copy of The Summer I Turned Pretty by Jenny Han came in. I watched the television adaptation, like the Amazon Prime adaptation. I thought it was cute, I thought it was summery, and I thought, hey, let's see these books. Like when I first joined the booktube community, I heard about Jenny Han all the time, and I never really read her work until I got into the adaptations, which are adorable. And it turns out my barriers for trash for film versus books are very different. I am more able to just turn off my brain when watching television. It is not good. Everything that is sort of charming about Belly on screen is grating to read. And I don't know how much, because it's been a while since I watched the show now, how much is the show sort of making Belly a more palatable character versus what is the charm of the actress playing her. And also the show gives more space to the moms, and I am now like old enough to have a teenager, so like when you see female friendships between women close to my age on screen, like I'm like, oh, I want to follow the parents. I want to hear about Laurel and Susanna's friendship. And the show does that. The show gives us Laurel and Susanna's friendship. It is difficult when then reading the book that is almost entirely from Belly's perspective to be stuck in her 16-year-old point of view and have her be an absolute brat and not like her. In addition to that, this is supposed to be, you know, a fun summer romance. Belly is the summer she turned pretty. It's the summer that the boys around her are suddenly seeing her as a sexual object. The premise of that is kind of gross, and it's one of those things that I think in the language of film we have been taught to accept, like the makeover montage, and then Anne Hathaway comes into school the next day with straight hair and no glasses, and you're like, wow.
Only Paolo can take this and give you
a princess.
Like reading it versus seeing it in like a space where it's accepted. Do you know what I mean? Is this making any sense? I hope it's making sense. I'm coming off of a very long day, of a very long week at work. We're trying to push out a really big website that's like high stress, highest grossing website we've ever made, and I'm QAing it and there were like 700 bugs. It's been a lot. Belly's a brat. Her best friend's a twat. Conrad, who is the love interest that Belly has been pining over for years, is an absolute red flag, bundle of red flags. Like, he's so controlling and overprotective. it is weird to me that Susanna would be rooting so hard for her children to marry, one of her children to marry her best friend's child. Also, it's very heterosexual, I guess. They assume that the boys wouldn't be interested in Stephen. But it just seems really gross. Like, I can't imagine if I had a child and my best friend had a child that we, like, raised together and, like, we spent time together and just acted as a family for significant chunks of time. I think it would be weird to not have those kids feel like siblings. Like, why does it even feel possible that Jeremiah and Conrad are love options, like love interests? Like, they've been raised as siblings almost, or cousins. And like, if Susanna and Laurel are really that close and they're raising their kids, not that they live together 24/7, it's just a summer thing, the months of the summer. But like, you would think that it would be like getting together with family versus getting together with a stranger who happens to have kids your age. And like, I don't understand why there is even a thought that these children would want to fuck after like growing up together. In reading the book, the whole premise of the thing feels icky now. So let's see if I can turn that part of my brain off when season 2 comes out on Amazon Prime. I finished that on October 16th. I gave it 1 out of 5 stars, and I borrowed that on audio from the library. And then I finally finished The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. So she is reimagining the island of Dr. Moreau, that classic sci-fi staple, against the backdrop of 19th century Mexico. And so we are looking at Carlotta Moreau, who is a young woman who's living with the scientist father, Dr. Moreau, in an isolated estate house in Yucatan. Dr. Moreau is financed by the Lizaldes in his human-animal hybrid experimentations. Things sort of crumble after one of the Lizaldes arrives and starts to seduce Carlotta. This took me a long time to get through. There was no urgency. I think I renewed it from the library 3 times before I finished it. Like, I would put it on occasionally, listen to it in chunks, and then forget about it, and the hold would expire. And then I'd get a notification being like, your hold expired and we returned it. And I'd be like, oh yeah, I should finish that. I should find out how that ends. And then I'd get back on the hold list, but there was no sense of urgency in finishing it. Definitely something didn't work for me about it, and part of me wonders if I'm not particularly attached to the source material, so I don't know if maybe it would have been more fun if I had read the source material more recently. It's been probably 10 years since I read The Island of Dr. Moreau, so not being super familiar with the source material, and then on top of that not being familiar with the historical conflict that is happening in this area, it felt like a lot and a little bit messy. I don't know. I didn't love it. I wish I did, because parts of it were cool that I don't want to say. Like, there's things that I thought were cool that I can't say because spoilers. Like certain revelations that I thought were interesting and could have maybe had a little more thought, a little more exploration, but we didn't. So I finished this on October 19th. I gave it 3 to 5 stars, and I borrowed it from Libby. Then I read Dark Archives by Megan Rosenbloom. So Megan Rosenbloom is a librarian and a deathling and a member of the Order of the Good Death. So if you're familiar with Caitlin Doughty's work, they're in that group of folks doing like death positive work. So she is exploring the history of anthropodermic books in this text. So it's a piece of nonfiction where she's looking at the history of books bound in human skin. There's like technology that is relatively recent, all things considered, that is able to take the smallest slivers of leather and break them down and identify proteins. And we're able now to identify proteins of great apes. Humans are great apes. There is no more specificity in that. That's how close we are to our great ape relatives. But there isn't really a history of binding books in like gorillas. So it's a pretty safe bet that if it shows up with the protein markers for great apes, that it's human. Almost all of the books that have been confirmed bound in human skin belong to a doctor at some point in the 19th century, I believe. So it's at that cusp in medicine where doctors are the experts over bodies. Science and research into medicine turns the doctor into the expert on your body. There's a shift in medicine in history where an ill person becomes a research subject, and at that moment in history where we don't have a lot of thought about the ethics, think like grave robbing for corpses to dissect, questionable medical studies happening on poor people, people of color. That era, understandably, that disconnect between the research subject and the humanity of the research subject results in doctors casually taking the entirety of somebody's back and preserving it and then binding a book in it, right? So there's a history that goes alongside books bound in human skin, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating if you are interested at all in medical history. So I think, and this is sort of like a weird text to like maybe ping off of, but if you have read The Immortal Life of Hennrietta Lacks, and what interested you about that was early medicine and like the history and ethics that have evolved because of the shit that was done historically in medicine, I think you might really enjoy Dark Archives. I mean, also if you're a deathling, if you're into the morbid, if you're into history, libraries, that sort of thing, this is an interesting read. And I feel like the narrative voice, Rosenbloom's voice is nice. It's not like Caitlin Doughty's. Caitlin Doughty has a very like witty, like humorous sense, and that comes across in her writing. But it's not like Mary Roach. Like I find Mary Roach covers topics that I would be interested in, but her writing is quite dry. It just doesn't gel with me. I would say Megan Rosenbloom is somewhere in the middle, closer to Doughty than Roach. I finished that on October 24th. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and that was a new buy. Then for the small book club in October, that was a live stream that I'll leave linked. I read The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, and that was the last small book club book of 2022. This is about the small town of Midwich. For 24 hours they are cut off from the outside world by some invisible force. Anybody who tries to cross this invisible force falls unconscious. 24 hours later it lifts and everybody under the dome is fine. Or so they think. Until several months later when all people of childbearing age discover they are pregnant. I think it was interesting. It was an interesting read and clever in many ways. So the people making decisions about the pregnant people's bodies are all men. The whole text is women's thoughts mediated by men. So a woman will express a concern like, gosh, it's frightening that I was raped by aliens and I have no idea what I'm going to give birth to in a few months. And she'll tell her husband that, and her husband will tell the committee of men who are deciding what's happening in Midwich. And that committee of men has our male protagonist, our male narrator, on it. And so he's telling us this story of this time in Midwich. And so everything is like voices removed, so we never hear from the women directly. This landed quite well. It stood up quite well in 2022. Like you would think something from the 50s, I think it's from 1957 if I'm not mistaken, it would not feel quite as relevant in 2022, but unfortunately it does. There are a lot of content warnings for this book. I do give those content warnings right off the top of the live stream. So it is dark material, but it's good. It's still good. And I think it might be my favorite of John Wyndham's books. So I finished that on October 25th. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and that came from my TBR. Then I read Meanwhile Back on Earth by Oliver Jeffers. This was a birthday gift from my mom, and it is Jeffers' latest picture book, and it is bleak. It looks at the history of human violence in terms of distance from planet. Imagine you got in a car and you were driving to like Mars. How many years that would take. And Jeffers goes back in time and is like, at this time, humans were blowing each other up. And then you go a little further on to a further planet and it's like, and at this time, humans were stabbing each other with swords. And so it's interesting as an adult reader. I have a hard time imagining this being easy to sell as a bookseller. Like, it is important to teach kids about history. It's just so bleak. It's so bleak. It was beautiful, like beautifully illustrated, haunting, definitely for sure. So I finished that on October 25th. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and that was, it's new to me because it was a birthday gift. Then we get into November. November, I read another 5 books. In November, I read the book that everybody was talking about this year, I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. I did not watch iCarly. I think I was too old for it when it came out, but I did get swept up in the drama of the story. Like, while not watching it, I was also familiar with its existence, you know? I knew it was a children's thing, so to, I guess, see some of the behind the scenes stuff, to hear about the abuse. McCurdy's mom was incredibly abusive, encouraged incredibly problematic behaviors, did some sexually abusive things. It was difficult to read. I can see why it got the traction it did. Finished that on November 1st. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars and I borrowed that from Libby. Then I read the other big hyped book of the year, Babel by RF Kuang. So it's set in a magical university in which British colonizers are using the language of their colonized to enhance their own magic. The magic has to do with like paired words, and when you find a pair, it does a magic. I don't think the point is really how the magic works. The point, I think, is watching somebody who is white passing. So our protagonist is Robin Swift, who is white passing. He's given this like formal education, but he is very much an outsider because he is not white enough for the white folks. There's a secret society of rebellious students who are questioning what the British Empire is doing, questioning why the British Empire is using the colonies for their wealth, not only of like materials, but language and magic, and keeping themselves in power using the wealth and knowledge and culture of the colonized. We see a lot of racism within the institution, and Robin is quite slow to pick up on that. I have heard that some folks are bothered by this, that it is I guess some folks feel it's too heavy-handed. I have a background in gender studies, which takes an intersectional approach to a lot of things. So this is not news to me, that the institution is oppressive and racist and sexist and classist, ableist, but I can imagine that for some readers it would be, and having certain things spelled out to get the point across is maybe not a bad thing. I thought it was fun while I was reading it. I could see why some people would feel it was heavy-handed, but at the end of the day, at least it has like a clear thesis, and it does seem to do what it set out to do. I finished that on November 4th. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I borrowed that from Libby. Then the sequel to The Summer I Turned Pretty came in at the library. That was called It's Not Summer Without You. This I actually liked because, spoilers, one of the characters is dead. This death causes Belly and her family to not go to the summer house for the first time since before she was born. Like, her mom was pregnant with her at the summer house. Like, it's literally an annual thing forever. And so it's breaking the routine the problem is that the dad wants to sell the summer house, and Conrad throws a temper tantrum, and it brings them all together, you know, for the summer at the summer house. This novel really makes Conrad look like hot trash. If I thought that Belly needed to move on before, like do some growing up, move on, stop trying to date her like weird cousin brother thing, this book confirms she should not date her weird cousin brother thing. For whatever reason, I did enjoy this more than the first one. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I finished this on November 7th. I did finish the series, but like really, I should have given up after the first one, but I was like morbidly curious at this point because this one, I'm like, oh, okay, you're continuing on after the TV show. I would like to see this. I really should have stopped, but of course, I will tell you about the third one shortly. In between, I read The Running Man by Richard Bachman. This is kind of like if 1984 and The Hunger Games had a baby, but it was published between both of them. Ben Richards enters into a reality show in which he is made like the most wanted man in America, and he is on the run from authorities and fellow citizens alike. For every day, I think he maintains his freedom. It's dollars into his pocket, into his family's pockets. And of course there are incentives for everybody else to like tattle on him and call the authorities on him and report him. It has some gross language, as do a lot of King's earlier works that are jarring and inexcusable. It has, I think I want to say it's use of the magical Negro trope. Bradley does not have magical powers in the way that Mother Abigail, John Coffey, Dick Halloran have magical powers, but he functions in much the same way. Like he puts his whole life and family at risk to further our protagonist, our white protagonist. It's an odd choice. There's never clearly a reason for it. That was yucky. I did see the ending coming from fairly early on in the novel. Skip it, I'd say. Don't make it your first Stephen King for sure. I finished that on November 12th. I gave it 3 to 5 stars the first time I read it. I then read it 2 more times in preparation for the live show. I think the rating did come down a little bit. This came from my TBR. I read Reputation by Lex Croucher. Lex Croucher was a YouTuber. I don't know if they make videos anymore. I follow them on Instagram. And the novel is Jane Austen meets Bridgerton meets Mean Girls. If we still consider Lex Croucher a YouTuber, I think it's one of the best like YouTuber books. Like I find that sometimes there are folks that I'm following and I'll pick up a book that they've written and I'm like, this probably sold because you have a built-in audience. Like, I don't know that this would be great in and of itself. And I'm not saying that this is the best thing ever, but it was fun. It was fun. It was funny. It was truly Jane Austen meets Mean Girls meets Bridgerton. Our protagonist Georgiana has moved in with her aunt and uncle, and her parents are like absent and like dicking around. And so she is attending these social events and making new friends, and she sort of falls in with the Regina George crowd and gets into trouble, drinking, drugs, etc. that could really tarnish her reputation and make her unmarriable. The reason I picked this up is because I saw that there was an arc for Infamous on NetGalley, and I was given access to it, and I think it's queer, maybe, based on the cover. Don't hold me to that. I will let you know when I read it. Obviously that means I am interested in giving Lex Croucher sort of another shot. Like, this wasn't my favorite book ever. It's not a new favorite, but I was interested in seeing more of what they are doing. So I finished that on November 19th. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and I guess it's technically new. I used an audiobook credit to get this. And here we go. Here is the last book. It is We'll Always Have Summer by Jenny Han. Wow, did this series go downhill and like absolutely derail. So we're in college now with Jeremiah and Isabel. She's no longer going by Belly, thank God. And they are college boyfriend and girlfriend. Isabel learns that Jeremiah cheated on her while they were on a break. They had a fight and he went off to spring break without her, and I guess he decided that would be the opportunity to have the sex that he wasn't getting with Isabel, because like Laura Jean, Isabel is like holding her virginity like way high above her head and like, neener, neener, you can't have it. It's gross. I hate when young adult texts do that. Like they put it on a pedestal and make it weird and precious. Like obviously having sex is a choice that everybody can make in their own time. I just don't love when young adult texts attach like a moral value to it almost. Now this could be because of when this is published, that other young adult texts have sort of crossed barriers that this text like hadn't dared to cross. Like the whole new young adult movement that is a lot more sexually explicit. I'm not saying that I want like a sex scene on page from Jenny Han, but I don't love that all of her characters, I get the impression that her characters are Christian without being explicitly Christian. Can I say that? Like, we all met those kids in high school. I was one of those kids in high school. The solution to their fight and to their no sex thing is apparently marriage. Jeremiah proposes to his 18-year-old girlfriend in college, and she says yes. And they spend the summer planning a wedding that Isabel does not really want to have. Her mom wants nothing to do with it. Jeremiah continues to prove himself like very immature, very like misaligned from Isabel, like to the point that he almost doesn't feel like the same character that we see in the other novels. It's like Isabel didn't really spend any time with Jeremiah. He was just there, and now they're dating and she sees what he's really like and she's like, yeah, I guess I'll say yes. That seems right. That's what you do. I don't even know. Like, I am baffled by the conclusion to this trilogy. I finished it on November 20th, 1 star, and I borrowed that from the library. Oh my gosh, thank God I borrowed those from the library, because what the heck? Like, what a hot mess. Those are the books that I read in the months of October and November. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Have you read any of these? Before we go, we have to thank my patrons who make videos like this possible. I really appreciate their support throughout the year, the work that they enable me to do. Links to the Patreon page are down below. There is one last patron live this year on Wednesday, December 14th at 7:30 p.m. We're going to be talking about Anna and the Apocalypse, the zombie Christmas musical, and also like chatting about this year of book clubs and like getting some feedback and planning for 2023. I hope you are all doing well, that you are staying safe, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye!